Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Friday, June 24th. This is your daily Buckeye fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Notre Dame game is in 71 days, the game against Michigan in 155 days. There are also 1,163 days until the 2025 Texas game. Why do I add that? Well, that will be played at Ohio State August 30th of 2025, and if all goes according to plan, junior quarterback Arch Manning will be leading the Longhorns into the horseshoe that day. The number one overall player in the class of 2025 just committed to Texas on Thursday, setting up what could be a completely insane matchup between him and 2024's top overall player, Dylan Raiola, who would be a sophomore at Ohio State that fall. That has the potential to be one of the biggest and most hyped non-conference games in Ohio State history, so today we're going to take a look back at some of the others that have happened over the years. My guest today is Kevin Noon, the host of the Big Me Kickoff podcast. Kevin, let's say Buckeyes are given a field goal against the Longhorns that day in 2025. Who you got?
Ohio State. I mean, Texas will be back eventually, but I don't think it's quite yet. I'm not even convinced that Steve Sarkisian's going to be the head coach there. That's going to be an interesting study to see how he does with his own program once again. The first run didn't necessarily go so well. If Ohio State keeps recruiting the way that Ohio State keeps recruiting, it's going to be difficult. But I think if we look through the history of non-conference series, it's not always a matter of the best team winning. It's just how the ball bounces a couple times.
The over under on number of head coaches, current Ohio State and current Texas head coaches who were on the sidelines that day is probably about 1.5. And there's obviously a lot that can happen in terms of those two quarterbacks not being the starting quarterbacks between now and then. And again, there are 3 full college football seasons that will be played before that game kicks off, so there's still a little ways to go. So instead of talking about that game in too much depth, instead I want to look backwards, because that one is going to be, assuming that kind of plays out as I sort of laid it out in the intro there, that is going to be a very, very highly anticipated game. You're going to be hearing about it on college sports radio or whatever the 2025 equivalent of college sports radio is for pretty much the whole year that year. But there have been other series that Ohio State has played that have been like that in the past. Just wanted to go through some of these. Kevin has covered a lot of them in person. I've covered a bunch of them in person, and some of them predate both of us, but just wanted to run through some of these that you guys may, some of our older listeners may have very clear memories of. Let's start with the team that is on the Ohio State schedule for this fall, Notre Dame. That 1995 and 1996 series against Notre Dame, the teams had not met since the 1930s. Notre Dame won both of the games in the 1930s, including a really dramatic comeback in the horseshoe behind a quarterback named Bill Shakespeare. You can't make it up. So in the 1990s, they had a quarterback named Ron Powlus. It did not go as well for them that time. 1995 was number 7 Ohio State versus number 15 Notre Dame. 1996 was much higher ranked, number 4 Ohio State versus number 5 Notre Dame. But just the matchup of those teams, Kevin, I was not at Ohio State in 1995, and the 96 game was on the road. But just I remember hearing people talk about how that was the series that people were most excited about in any they could remember at that point.
Exactly. I'd just gotten out of Ohio State just prior. I was working for the ABC affiliate here in Columbus. I was too valuable to the operation to get to go to the game. I had to be back producing the show itself, the pre and post game show. So I got to see little bits and pieces. I got to go out early. I mean, I was watching it on television, but just the proximity of the two schools, South Bend, where it is in relationship to Columbus, Ohio. I mean, obviously we have a lot of Catholics in the greater Central Ohio area that had their allegiances pulled a little bit. Well, on Sundays I really care about Notre Dame, but on Saturdays I really care about Ohio State. So there was just a ton of juice going into that game, and Ohio State obviously took care of business in both of them, but I would say of all the non-conference series, once we were in the midst of it, that was the one that I felt the most heat based on that one because of just the proximity. Ohio State doesn't have an in-state rival. I mean, sorry, Cincinnati. They just don't have somebody who's right here. And then, obviously all of the other big powers around are conference foes. So you get them, you would think, every year, if not every few years, based on how Big Ten scheduling works. But with it being a minute between Ohio State Notre Dame games, having to go back to the 30s, there were a lot of people from ages 8 to 80 that were all excited about it.
That's one that you hear people talk about helmet games where it's exciting just to see the two uniforms out on the field together. You don't get to see them that get to see those two, the silver helmets for Ohio State and the gold helmets for Notre Dame. Like I remember watching on TV and thinking, oh, that's really cool seeing these two teams out there together. And yeah, they had not played in what 60 years almost at that point. So now they've got another series coming up this year. They've played a couple bowl games in the middle, but it does not happen very often. A lot of hype for those. Another team that Ohio State had actually never played before this series was Texas, 2005, 2006. That was 2005 was, one of the many kind of game of the century type non-conference games that Ohio State has played over the years. That was number 4 Ohio State, number 2 Texas, and that was one. I was there for that one. That was a great game from beginning to end. That was a real slugfest. That you get all the everyone wants to have the Ryan Hamby, what if he caught it kind of conversation about that game. The real question is, what if Troy Smith had, started that Miami game to start the season and had been, sort of ensconced as the starter? He seemed to be moving the team a little bit better up and down the field that day, kicking a lot of field goals, and that ended up catching up to him in the end. But that one was number 4 versus number 2. In retrospect, that one feels bigger, but the better rated game was actually the year after. It was number 1 Ohio State versus number 2 Texas. The 2005 game looks bigger in retrospect as Texas goes on to win the national championship. That Ohio State team ended up putting together a really, really good season, only lost twice, and absolutely destroyed Notre Dame in the Fiesta Bowl. The year after, Texas kind of fell apart in 2006. Ohio State, how Ohio State's 2006 season ended. But that was a 1 versus 2. That was another one that the hype leading up to that game was about as high as the hype meter goes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you go and you look at that one. I was not in Columbus for the '05 game. I was back in Columbus for 6, I believe. Um, so I certainly got to hear all of the buzz and everything that was going on around all of that. I spent some time living in the state of Texas and had a lot of buddies who were UT alum who were talking a lot of trash to me. And then when Ryan Hamby did not, wasn't able to catch that pass, I mean, they all came out pro, and I probably had a few bets to pay off at that point. Gambling is illegal at Bushwood, sir. And then in 6, I certainly remember seeing on the television. I wasn't at the game. Matthew McConaughey on the sidelines, Eddie George on the sidelines. I mean, there was a lot of juice in that one, and Ohio State just looked really good. Ohio State seemed to learn from a couple of its mistakes, and was able to take it to them. But I really had a lot of fun with that Texas series just because of the places that I'd lived and having friends that were very passionate about it.
Another one that's one of these big intersectional matchups, a lot like Ohio State Texas. Ohio State USC. Those are teams that have played. They had not played Texas at all before that 2005 game. They have played them. They had played USC a bunch, but it was generally in the Rose Bowl, and generally those did not go real well for Ohio State over the years. They won at least one. They won in the 1974 Rose Bowl, and they won in the 1969 one rather famously. But there were a lot of Rose Bowl losses to USC as well. That was a home and home in 2008, 2009. The first one was out in the Coliseum. Very, very hyped team. It is the only non-conference regular season game that Ohio State has played against the number 1 team in the nation since they played Cornell in 1940. So, and OSU was not ranked for that 1940 Cornell game, as I'm sure you all remember. The Buckeyes were number 5 in that 2008 game. So number 1 USC, number 5 Ohio State. How did that game go? Well, we don't have time for that. Let's talk about next year's game. Number 8 Ohio State, number 3 USC in the horseshoe. How'd that game go for Ohio State? Well, we don't have time to talk about that either, Kevin. They were, though, 2 very, very, those were games that, again, leading up that whole summer before both of those games, that was pretty much all anyone in Columbus was talking about.
Yeah, and I can go back even further. I know your research did take you this far back. The first Ohio State game that I remember as a student at Ohio State, going to Ohio State was never really in the plans for me. I thought at one point I was going to go to USC. And in '89 they played them, and in '90 they played them. In '90, I believe, was the Coop Cooper is a quitter game where it was the Lightning game, and they called the game because Ohio State had fallen behind a couple of scores and the weather was getting quite dangerous at the time. But to me, when I just think of classical non-conference series, Ohio State and SC, and yeah, a lot of that does go back to the Rose Bowl. I mean, the Pac-8, Pac-10, Pac-12, what have you, depending on how far back you go against the Big 10, 11, 12, 14, whatever it is now. You know, Ohio State certainly has fared better recently against SC than it has in those non-conference series. Um, I still have some very vivid memories of the Stanley Havili game out there at SC, and I had told the guy who was working with me at the time, I said, if Ohio State just keeps this game close, we're going to Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles afterward. And Ohio State did not keep it close. I think, what was it, like 35-3, and it probably should have been worse. Um, but Pete Carroll moved on, and SC came back down to the rest of the pack, and, as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah, the early '90s USC Ohio State series was another good one. Those teams were just not quite ranked quite as highly as some of the ones we're talking about here. Another one where there were some real highly ranked teams, the Oklahoma series, 2016, 2017. 2016, Ohio State was number 3, Oklahoma only number 14. The Buckeyes went in there and won that one. That was the game where Noah Brown had 4 touchdown receptions, including the one caught on the Oklahoma defender's back. That was, famously the Noah Brown game. And 2017, that was the Baker Mayfield flag plant game. That was number 2 Ohio State, number 5 Oklahoma. That's another one where you came in and that was one of those where you came in, the shoe is rocking. It's like, oh, there's no way that Oklahoma's going to win this game. And then Oklahoma won that game. And a running back named Trey Sermon, who would go on to some success at Ohio Stadium later in his career, played some for Oklahoma in that game. But, this is another one of those where it's not just the high rankings. It's the brands, it's the helmets, it's the history of the two programs, where you go back 50 years and Oklahoma and Ohio State, I think, are the two teams with the fewest losing seasons over the last 50 years. They are just always pretty much good outside of, the occasional weird season for Ohio State or the late 90s for Oklahoma. They're always good. They're always among the, top 5, 10 teams in the nation pretty much as a given every single year. So when you get a chance to see them play, that's always pretty cool.
Yeah, it's one of those video game type of games, because you get the video game and you get to pick the two teams. Like, well, if you're not going to play for real on the field, I'm going to sit there and I'm going to make you play each other on the video game, and get to see that, to be able to go and witness those games. And I remember the game at Oklahoma certainly being a case of where, yes, it was the Noah Brown game, and then I was driving back from the stadium pretty late at night, and in one of the worst hailstorms that I've ever driven through. I'm like, thank God I have the insurance on this rental car. The weather don't joke around in those parts. And then, of course, the Baker Mayfield game. Kind of, I think we're running out of time, so I don't want to talk too much about that one. But all of the elements were there for that big Ohio State win, and Ohio State couldn't quite get the job done in that one, and it introduced Ohio to Baker Mayfield, and I don't think he's done anything in the state since.
Yeah, Baker Mayfield, at that point, one of the most hated players in the state of Ohio, and then for a while, one of the most beloved players in the state of Ohio, and now I don't know that we can grade him. You're almost grading him incomplete at this point. Not sure how that story is going to end. Those are the ones that I kind of had at sort of top of the list, but I'm going to run through a couple of these others, and you let me know if you have any strong thoughts on any of these. Several of these are going to be before your time at Ohio State and before my time at Ohio State. Number 1983, Oklahoma, one of their previous home and homes. They were number 2. They had Marcus Dupree as a sophomore, that superstar running back who just could never quite stay healthy. Ohio State was number 6. We talked about the Noah Brown game. This was the John Frank game. Ohio State tight end John Frank blew up. Ohio State beats Oklahoma at Oklahoma in 1983. 1986, number 9, Ohio State. Number 5, Alabama. That was in the Kickoff Classic game at the old Giant Stadium in New Jersey. That one ended up 16-10. Ohio State had a Jim Carsato's throwing to Chris Carter in the end zone for a potential game-tying / game-winning touchdown, and the last play of the game fell incomplete. Ohio, that was one that, top 10 matchup, again, a real helmet game. That was not an Ohio State team that they were okay, but they didn't finish the season the way you probably wanted to. They lost to Michigan. That was the Jim Harbaugh guarantee game year. 1987, number 7 Ohio State goes to number 4 LSU. That game ends up a 13-13 tie. That was the year that Earl Bruce ended up getting fired. They finished 6-4-1 that year. So, that was a very, very, very big game at the time. That then looking back, it doesn't seem like it was a big game because it was two teams that didn't finish particularly well. Another one that I think is real underrated that I think everyone forgets about. This is one of the most shocking Ohio State upset wins probably of the last last half century maybe. Ohio State does not get to be the underdog very often. They were in 1992. Number 21 Ohio State goes into the Carrier Dome and just eviscerates number 8 Syracuse 35-12. And for all you kids out there, Syracuse actually used to be a thing. That used to be a football team that played and actually mattered in the early 90s. And was that a Marvin Graves Syracuse team, I think?
Was that a Brian Stabline Ohio State team?
That was, I believe, a Brian Stabline Ohio State team. That was a Kirk Herbstreit Ohio State team.
I was an undergrad at the time. I remember watching the game and consuming mini beers on campus at the street scene. And yeah, Syracuse used to be. Yeah, I mean, there was a guy that played there that went on to have a pretty okay pro career. Donovan McSomething or other, McNabb. That's right. Yeah,
That was late 90s. This was early 90s.
but they was still a thing. I know they were. Yes, yes.
Yeah, Ohio State goes into Syracuse as a big underdog, wins, and then their season blows up when they go play a traditional Big Ten bottom feeder on the road and somehow lose that terrible Big Ten team, Wisconsin. The early 90s, it was a little different than right now. So number 20, that Syracuse team actually finished 10-2 in the season. The only other team they lost to was Miami. That was the Miami team that went on to play the George Teague Sugar Bowl game against Alabama at the end of the season. That was that Miami team beat Syracuse by 6. That was the only other team to beat them that year. And then Ohio State goes in there and wins by 23. That was one of the more underrated, shocking road games. And then finally, one very recent, one not quite as recent, against teams from the Pacific Northwest. Oregon last year, of course, you know all about that. But also 2002, number 6 Ohio State, number 10 Wazoo. The Jason Gesser game, that was that was a game that came in with a lot of hype. That was an Ohio State team, Jim Tressel's second year. You didn't quite know what they had yet. They had been real impressive against Texas Tech in the opener. You didn't quite know what they had. And then they thumped Wazoo pretty convincingly, and it was kind of like, oh, this Jim Tressel cat may have something going here.
Well, and the funny thing too is that, we were kind of talking about this in the pre-show conversation we had. Now you're really kind of booking games so far out, you don't know what you're going to get. When Ohio State booked its home and home with Cal, Cal was coming off of some pretty good seasons, and then by the time Ohio State got there, they were not very good. I can remember series with Washington being like that. It was very different than the series with Washington back, I guess, in the 90s. And then you also have the instances too of where you have a home and home series that just turns into a one-off game like TCU. But you just don't know what you're going to get. And then one other point I want to make too, Ohio State's also had some series called off along the way. They had a Georgia and a Tennessee series that were called off once the Big Ten went into a scheduling alliance with the Pac-12, and then the Big Ten went to 9 conference games. The scheduling alliance was scuttled, and that was the end of that.
And they do have some very big non-conference series coming up. Obviously Notre Dame the next 2 years. They've got a cut series with Washington, home and home with Washington coming up, which Washington was not very good the last couple of years under Jimmy Lake. Jimmy Lake is out, so you'll have to see kind of which kind of Washington team do you get? Because Ohio State played a very, very good Washington team a few times in the early 90s, and then played some very bad Washington teams in the early 2000s and early to mid 2000s. And so we'll just kind of have to see what kind of Washington team they get in a couple of years. But yeah, they've got the Texas series coming up. You got an Alabama series coming up. You got a Georgia home and home coming up. So assuming some of those do actually happen, those are definitely going to be on this list as well at some point when we do this show again in 12 years or so. Looking back at all of those, also extremely hyped, extremely anticipated early season non-conference series.
And maybe they'll play Boston College finally. Maybe they'll finally play Boston College, as that game has been sliding down the schedule for at least the last 20 years. So, I mean, I think that game is like in the 2040s now at some point. play it or cancel it. I mean, it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's the Jelly of the Month Club. They're going to eventually get to it.
They will eventually play Boston College. Maybe, probably, maybe, possibly. We'll see. But yeah, that's there are some good non-conference teams on the schedule moving forward. So there should be plenty of fun off-season talk for podcasts for years and years to come. And speaking of podcasts that are going to be going for years and years, Kevin's Big Me Kickoff. You can find that. You can find the Buckeye Weekly podcast that Tony Girdman and I do. You can find the Gives in the Bank podcast that Mark Givler and Bill the Bank Green do. You can find Around the Oval from Alex Gleitman. You can find them all just by searching Buckeye Scoop wherever you find this podcast. You can subscribe right there. They are all fantastic shows, all worth a listen, and all, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, worth a 5-star rating and review as well. If you feel the same way, please leave that for us. That will help other folks find those shows. That'll do it for today. That'll do it, in fact, for this week. No, it's not. Yes, it will. Tomorrow's Friday. Today's Friday. It's been a long week. It will, in fact, do it for today and this week. Have a great weekend. I sure hope I do. We'll talk to you on Monday.